Welcome to Very Honored Frater Beauty's Esoterinerd Podcast, episode 32, in which I interview Bryan Dietrich. But first, The Lost Word by Bryan Dietrich, as recited by Worshipful Clive Revill, PM.
Whitman died chasing champignons, seeking grammar for God, a uniform hieroglyphic, American answers for Egyptian enigmas. Still, he found no stone, no Virginia Rosetta, dead language, dead union, leaves of grace. From Humboldt's humble hunch to Grimm's Lauterverschiebung, to Chomsky's mysterious miracle, we seek first clause, the name of he who names. And Adam? No. What logic was ever uttered in Eden? Do not eat, said the seraphim. Do not partake of this knowledge, this that would make you obey. You should not know what not is not for you. Do not eat, do not, and burn with desire. Do, and burn with despite. Boethius in his cell, Socrates on his couch, Aristotle, Aristarchus, Beauvoir, Beauregard, all sought solace in symmetry, argument, artifice, art, in the desert of the real. Suppose Saussure got rhetoric right. Here, look for where it begins, where a saying starts. Posit unknown from known, and watch the signs signify what you never intended. Publish what you never published. Argue what others only ever said you said. No. Begin again without yourself, with yourself only signified, referent to nothing. Imagine nothing. Argue even after death, after silence, always after that. Provide. Provide. Bakhtin knew, and Barthes, Eco, and Foucault. There is no general course, nothing but everything outside the cave, the lingering linguistics of longing. Velikovsky wanted something out of nothing, too. Wanted Jupiter, Dew, Pitar, God, Father, this and Venus fully formed from his brow. Wanted it so much he made it out of math. Wanted equations proving the planets Pong, spat forth from storm and eye, his imagined proto-planet zigzagged through our solar system, passing sister Earth, parting the Red Sea, dropping manna. None of this, of course, happened, except it did on paper, on papyrus, among the numbers of the many means of God. So, geometry also. Not just grammar or logic, rhetoric or arithmetic. There are always other roads. Remember, Escher drew us into the plain, made the stairs that take us where all stairs should go, bridged our absence where nothing becomes something becomes nothing again. Dimensions divided, angles arbitrated, hand drawing hand, etching images of enzymes and ants, geese and gravitas. Humanity and infinity, the romance of reflection. We are the shapes that shake us. We shape the shaped us. But having no end, owning no original arc, we lose ourselves in the labyrinth, looking, always looking, mounting the stair, modelling Moebius, moving across the great girth of Earth's grid, plotting, rising, falling, always falling into formula. Finally, there is Mozart. Mozart and Drake. We could mention so many, humanity's long lineage of making meaning of the moans the moon makes, spinning seas up from darkness, spitting us forth, calling us home. Musicians and astronomers, all the madmen and the maimed, all trying to mutter the music of the spheres. Mozart plucked it down to player's performance. Drake made math out of why we might pluck it all. Mozart gave voice to the wolf, to the hour when the stars speak, when our souls seek anything but silence, everything as silence. Drake defined the size and scope of said silence, said lightly, we have never been alone. The number of communicating civilizations in the galaxy, the number of other souls, the sheer volume of possible answers to our ancient arrogance, our quixotic questions, the name of the being who best knows God. Even if the number is a fraction of a trillion, the number of stars we see most close about us, this galaxy, this home, if the number is even the smallest part of 300 sextillion stars saturating the larger unseen scope of sky, all we know and don't know, if they too have planets, which they will, if they too have seekers, which they will, if they too have Huygens, Hawkings, Shakespeares, Saussures, Golems, Grimms, Mondrians and Mozarts, and Masons, which they will, they too will have sought all that is not, all that is. They too will have waited for the word, carved in bone, in sandstone, in gnarl and gneiss. They too will have hollowed out caves at their version of Karnak and Kallanash, Jericho and Jeju Island, Turabong and Toposiris temples. Always temples to the word. But what is it, this word we seek, this emptiness nothing seems to satiate? What I am, what I am not. From Chauvet to Chartres, from Tantan to Berikat Ram, to Teotihuacan, nothing becomes the something we desire. Desire becomes reason to reanimate all matter that matters. Golem, God particle, golden record. We put our words between ourselves and that which we cannot name. Holy of holies, JH, VH, IN, RI, ACTG, SETI. Letters. Always letters on the face of the deep. Christ carving his word in the dirt, a code to keep the craven at bay. Cain on his knees at the watering hole, washing, a sign unutterable, a stain that will not but stay. A rabbi entering the temple, God's name aflame on a tongue he dare not wag. And the temple at Karnak, a name spoken to bring back the sun, the loci screaming it, eternal in the dark, in pain, beneath the brunt of everything earth. And Yeats, turning and turning to nothing in his nodding tower, and Crowley, levelling law, and everyone. Bradbury channeling childhood from the stars, Melville scribbling spotless as a lamb, Eliot shoring up ruins, Rushdie and Lessing and Lovecraft and dear dead Dostoevsky. Everyone. Clemens to Clarke, Dante to Dickinson, Faulkner, last man on this doomed dark rock. Einstein, Ellison, Edison, Morrison, quill to kinetoscope, pumice to papyrus, Gutenberg to Gettysburg, to Googled Glees. We have made our marks, made our signs, sent them sailing, soaring, failing into the night. What words? All words. All but the one we have sought. All but the right word, the one we lost before the rest. The name of the one who made us, laid us brick by brick, set us on the level, encompassed our corners, rounded what was rough, set square that which strayed, the one who tamped us, tested us, smiled upon us, deep as the deepest temple. The one who bevelled all that cannot be altered. Altar, salter, stair, infinite author of our inner path, origin of everything more, everything or. Article, particle, core, more light. At the centre of all, before that first, last, best disaster. We seek it fast. We seek it faster. We seek our master.
Our guest tonight is the poet who wrote these words, Bryan Dietrich. Let's get to the interview, shall we?
Greetings, Frater. Welcome to the Esoterinerd podcast.
Greetings. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well.
So I just finished listening to the recital of the poem. It strikes me overall as it takes you by surprise because it seems to be a reflection about other poets, and then by the end you realize that you've been involved in a great poem.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's a poem that includes other poets.
Well, poets and writers and thinkers and scientists. And,
using the term loosely, yeah. Even mathematicians and yeah, of course.
All kinds of makers and shakers in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, but then its tone, you're not sure if it's depressing, because it's like everybody reaching for, it's like all the moths reaching for the flame and only reaching it with a spark at the end, or is it inspiring because there's all these great authors next to Crowley and next to these great magicians, and then there's me, and I'm a poet too, and I feel the call and I resonate with this poem, but yet it's both. I guess it requires transcendence to really digest.
Oh. Thank you. I think, well, of course, originally it was written for Curtis Shoemaker, who was being installed as the master of his lodge there in L.A. And I loosely based it around the staircase lectures, the idea of the seven liberal arts, and so I wanted to talk about humanity's striving toward meaning, right. At whatever level, whether we're talking about the invention of language, which, we get into Chomsky and Grimm and that kind of stuff, or whether we're talking about, more extreme versions of that kind of understanding with later linguists like Saussure, and then on to various kinds of inquiries into, well, how we see the world and how we interact with our interpretation of our place in that world.
Yeah.
And for me, I think at the heart of it, which is honestly at the heart of a lot of what I write, is this notion that we're always striving to fill an absence.
Right.
And that absence becomes the presence of our art. And that really seemed to me to connect to the notion of the lost word, that there is this, if we could just get that word, if we could get that name, and whether we say that's God or whether we say that's inspiration, whatever we call that, well, what is that?
Right.
And that's what we're, molding, whether it be in ink or paint or numbers or clay, some kind of simulacrum of our relationship to the world and how we understand it.
Yeah.
I have poems that are really sort of, straightforward and user-friendly, if you will, personal kinds of things, and much more immediate, easily digestible language.
Right.
Then I've got a whole slew of, actually whole books of poems that are more like this, which are really dense and brick-like and full of references. And
it makes me feel like I need to hit up the local library. Yeah. I'm like, wow, I got about a third of these references.
Well, see, I very much, I adore poets like Sharon Olds and Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath, and those who speak from personal experience and talk very simply about their lives. But then there's another side of me that very much loves Stevens and Auden and Eliot and Yeats and Hopkins, particularly Hopkins all the time, who are not easy.
Right.
And so I vacillate in poetry back and forth between those two things, and I have no idea whether any of it works, but it makes me happy.
Yeah. I like the idea of, sometimes basing poetry on, the Sephirot or maybe the Paths or the Sefer Yetzirah or something like that, having a format that's already kind of, in a way been done already, but I'm going to do it my way, and I'm going to do it today, and I'm going to do it, customized to what I'm saying right now, the five elements or something. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I've got, oh goodness, I've got an epic that I've been working on for years that revolves around the tarot, and I've got
great.
Well,
the minors too.
Primarily the major arcana, but then it's okay. Well, all right. I'm just going to say this. That's the formatting of the poem revolves around that, but the content is about the life, rise, and fall of David Koresh.
Oh, interesting.
So this idea of someone who believes himself to be Savior and martyr and Messiah.
Starting with the Fool or starting with the world?
Oh, good Lord! I have to go back to my notes, but I think I believe I start with 0 and end with 21. So
yeah. So this innocent idea of, what if I could be Jesus, and then making it happen in the magician card.
Yeah, and
meeting the high priestess who'd go along with it.
I went for several days down to. Well, of course, I was living in Denton, Texas when I started this thing, and then I was there when all of this when it happened, and I was watching it live on the news when ATF surrounded the compound, and
Yeah.
and all of these things happen. And then, of course, you get these covers of, Weekly World News saying face of David Koresh seen in cloud over, all of this
Right.
stuff. And I saw this sort of modern myth in the making. And then it was a few years later I realized, I really want to write about this. And so I actually went back down to Waco and spent several days interviewing people and spent some time with a woman who was I think she was 85, who was still living on the compound, and was a follower of Koresh and saw this as the sign of the end times, and that the Messiah had passed and he would be returning. And at the same time, there was a woman set up in a tent at the gate to the compound who was the anti-Koresh, and she had all of these slogans on the outside of her tent. And so I talked to both of them, and it was just this powerful experience of watching a modern myth unfold. And that's the kind of thing that I'm always interested in, whether it's a person who, directly or indirectly leads to the deaths of 82 people, or whether it's, Superman, who's created by two young boys in Ohio who suddenly decide, well, we need a new hero because the Nazis are coming.
Yeah. So you write poetry. Do you write prose?
I do. I started off originally doing both equally.
Mm-hmm.
And then around 1990, I kind of shifted and focused exclusively on poetry, and I did that until about 5 years ago. I only wrote poetry and some essays, but primarily poetry. And then I got an opportunity to take a sabbatical at my university, and my provost said, well, Bryan, if you're going to do something interesting, I'm sure that you've got to pick one thing because you're always trying to do 12. And so I said, well, if I can only do one thing during the sabbatical, I want to do the one thing that I haven't really done, and that's write a novel. And so since then, I've written 2 novels. I've started a third, and I've written half a dozen short stories.
Nice.
And I've gotten back to the prose.
So how can we find that? Is it is with the D initial in between, or?
Talk to some editors at a publisher somewhere and say, buy this book, and then maybe it'll show up.
Dang it! So it's unavailable.
They're still so new.
Right.
The first novel was, I'm going to call it my starter novel. It's now in the first novel trunk. It's sitting and curing in the barrel, to mix metaphors. The second novel is with, I think, the second or third agent. So
okay.
I'm still striving.
Is it sci-fi or fantasy?
The first novel was sci-fi / horror. The second novel is straight up horror.
Okay.
Well, I say straight up horror. It's horror and sort of confessionalist life memoir kind of thing, but it's all fictionalized. So yeah. So the second book is it's called Strawberry Girl, and it's about a kid who moves to Memphis with his father, who's recently been divorced in 1980, and begins to suffer under the thumb of various bullies that are off the charts, setting his hair on fire on the bus and that kind of thing.
Right.
And not that there's anything personal in that. And eventually falls in love with a girl who dies, and then he raises her, and she becomes his avenging teen angel.
Nice.
It's kind of a Christine for the new millennium.
That sounds like fun. And the short stories, are they mostly horror or?
They are primarily sci-fi.
Okay.
Because I'm a big genre guy when it comes to the prose. So yeah, and I've been getting really good feedback, but they're still circling the landing strip, waiting for a place to dock.
Right. I've decided finally to, I have a few other podcasts besides this one. So one of them is my sci-fi radio show podcast, The Coffee House and Interdimensional Odyssey. Little plug there. But,
great.
Yeah, I'm slowly revealing a story that's been over 20 years in the making, and so there's only 3 episodes up there so far.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, it's between, and I resonate with that too. I have another one called the Coffee or Gwydion's Astral Podcast, where it's mostly poetry, and so I make it as unpleasant as possible, so people will just automatically turn it off unless they really want to listen to my poetry. You know.
Well, you know, there's this vast chasm between what you experience with poetry and what you experience with prose, and it's reflected in the market, such as it is. It's reflected in people's opinions. It's particularly reflected in the way that you encounter the writing itself. You know, if I'm writing a poem like The Lost Word, I'm very much lost in the language and the collision of words, and I can spend hours just messing with a line or 2 lines or 1 word.
Yeah.
You know, and I get pulled into that linguistic problem, right? But when I'm working on a novel or a story, I'm lost in a different way, and I can spend hours just lost in that world that's been created, these characters and what they're doing.
Yeah.
They're very different writing experiences. But insofar as publishing goes, it's kind of similar. You know, I mean, it took, well, let's see. I started sending poetry out to publish in 1982. And the first place I sent to was the New Yorker, because I was an idiot. And so I, you know, started collecting rejection letters from them and everyone else on the planet for years and years. My first sale for a poem to the New Yorker was 2008. So 26 years later, it takes time.
Yeah.
You know, I started sending out my first book of poems in 1994, and it managed to find, well, you know, won this huge prize and stuff, and nice. Came out in 2002. So that was 7 years. So I figure I've got at least 2, 3, maybe 10, 20 more years to wait on the prose. If it's the same sort of cycle, you know.
Right.
I mean, one is you're learning your craft, and the other is that you're learning who your listeners are, who wants to hear that.
Right.
You know, whether it's a poem or a story.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I guess with my poetry, I treat more as I took something to heart when I was reading Jodorowsky's interview in the book called Psychomagic, and he said you should write a poem every day. So I started doing that kind of as a shamanic self-psychotherapy exercise. And so a lot of it I would hide, and, you know, because it wasn't something I wanted to, like, share with anybody, because it was just a outpouring of frustration from the day.
Right.
And so then eventually that's what's on a lot of what's on Gwydion's Astral Podcast. So I disassociate myself and say it's Gwydion, so that's my pen name. And I always refer to him as third person, because he's a very grumpy guy sometimes, and I don't agree with most of what he says. So. Yeah, I don't disassociate myself with the writing, but I do disassociate myself with the marketing, right? So I have this whoever it is, I'm not sure, I don't have a name, but you know, there's writer guy and there's the car salesman. Right. You know, writer guy just writes shit. Oh, that's a good idea.
Can I say that? Okay.
Yeah.
And then you know, marketer guy then steps in when I'm not working on something, not really, invested in the art, and says, all right, now what do we do with this?
Yeah. Puts on a suit, and like shakes hands and smiles. And,
yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, because I just really don't think you need those two people in the same room at the same time.
Right.
Because I mean,
it's like the director and the editor.
Yeah. As you know, poetry, it's not about money. It's about a passion for the language,
communication from the heart of something unique that's never been expressed before. Yeah,
and that's a whole. Well, it is kind of a magical. Ritual.
Oh, it's the beginning of it's shamanic. I mean, every religion has its roots in some kind of poet. I mean, some kind of poet, rolling his eyes back, probably on mushrooms, like 90% of them.
Or gases from the volcanic vents at Delphi, right? Setting aside the drugs or the volcanic gases.
Of course.
There's the rhythm. There's the rhyme or lack thereof. There's whatever form you're working with. There are the line breaks. There's the ritual of the filled space on the page. There's the attention spent looking at, in my case, since my major influence is Hopkins, how much alliteration can I get by with? So there's all of these mnemonic and linguistic patterns that become litanies, that become they start shaping the connections, the pathways in your brain. And they direct your thinking in I think extraordinary ways.
The old minstrels.
So that the next time you come back to the next poem, or perhaps even the same poem a few days later, you at the same time revisit those same pathways or have an opportunity to deviate and recognize now here's a new path.
Right.
And I'm not sure how different that is from the kinds of things that, say, Campbell talks about in initiation rites in any of his writing, but particularly Heroes of 1,000 Faces. As you crawl through the cavern to get to the secret vegetative ritual that's taking place under the earth. I think we're doing it with the words.
And word is a symbol. If you expand the definition of word to include all symbols, then every part of the initiation is a communication. I mean, somebody really had something to say and didn't trust words alone to convey it, and so they do it through a ceremony.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The old minstrels in Old English, before what it was the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons, their endings and their suffixes on the words were so different that they just dropped them after a while of intermarrying and stuff and trading between the two cultures. So word order became very important. But prior to that, they had all those endings that made it impossible to rhyme all the time. So they'd repeat the same consonant in the first stanza or the first line, and then they'd start the second line with that same letter, and they'd have that certain rhythm, and that became, and the reason why they kept needing to come up with new ways of saying old things, because you couldn't say battle or war. Sometimes you had to say sword play to make sure you had that S sound in there, and so and that's already buried in our linguistic patterns in our brain.
Oh yeah, you have those alliterative repetitions. You have the strong beats for each line. You have the kennings that allow them to rename things over and over. The kind of stuff that, of course, Tolkien borrowed from.
Oh yeah, and Shakespeare. Yeah.
Heavily,
and my
Carol
dad,
Writer and Green Bearer and
totally.
Or in the case of the actual Old English, Wave Rider, and so those are fascinating tools, and they cross cultures. There's a beautiful essay on a lot of this by Frederick Turner, who I revere as the great new modern formalist poet.
Nice.
He wrote an epic called Genesis and another called The New World, and he's written all kinds of things. But he has a controversial essay called The Neural Liar, where he talks about how these across cultures there's a certain amount of time required for each line in poems cross-culturally, and that those times mimic the amount of time it takes for the brain to process new information. And so what he argues is that poetry is actually it's physically, biologically formative for the brain itself, and that it so mimics the activity of the brain that it reshapes the brain. Now,
sense.
whether you buy into that or not, I love the idea.
Yeah. That's why it's so obnoxious when people read their poetry really fast.
Yeah.
You're like, well, it sounds good, but I couldn't follow it. Yeah. Or a good ritual is supposed to be delivered slow, stern, solemn, strong, all those S's. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's, and since I do so much with horror, it's the same thing that bothers me about horror films these days, film in general, but particularly horror film. I grew up on a steady diet of 60s and particularly 70s horror film, that it's slow, creeping, psychological, building terror. That's what I'm used to.
Right.
But what we get today, and I would argue probably whether it's film or written horror, it's quick cut MTV horror, right? It's that's not how you. I'm sorry, I don't think that's how you experience horror. I don't think that's how you experience the divine. I don't think that's how you experience learning.
Yeah. That's how you experience an advertisement.
Yeah.
That's basically it.
Get to the point.
Everybody else is just trying to compete with the advertisements.
Yeah.
It's insidious. Oh, not like the movie. That's the point, though. It's case in point. Oh my God! One of the guys, the guy that played the scary old woman in Insidious, called me once at work, and he said something about Insidious 2. He wanted to get paid for something, and because I worked at SAG, and I said, "Oh, they're making another one." I said, "I bet it's even more insidious than the first one." And he's like, "What? What was that? What's your name, young man?" I'm like, "Oh my God, are you seriously taking yourself seriously for being the scary old woman?" And Jesus Christ, a movie that's terrifying kids about the idea of astral projecting? Like that's insidious. That is insidious. The movie is not. Anyway.
Yeah. There's so little. I'm going to sound like an old curmudgeon. I'm going to sound like I used to make fun of when I started writing. But there's so little that allows us peace and thought and the slow consideration of deep ideas.
Right.
When my son was getting ready to graduate high school and was headed off to college, I said, if I could wish you anything, it would be to learn patience and acceptance. Don't let the video games and the iPhones and the instant connection to the internet, don't let the ether age divest you of your human qualities. And I think there are wonders. Of course I have an iPhone, and of course we have, Netflix, we have, all of these things that he does, but I grew up in a different age when things were slower, and I value that, and I think human beings have spent, at minimum 70, some would say maybe 100,000 years developing brains that work in one way, and we're now at the point where we're crossing the threshold into thinking in a new way, which is not necessarily bad, but I think
used to it yet.
Yeah, and I think it should exist alongside the deeper, more contemplative things that we can learn from, say, transcendental meditation, or, Buddhist breathing, or writing a poem, right?
Absolutely.
So that's my soapbox for the day. I'll get off it now.
Right on. Yeah, I appreciate sci-fi for some of the same reasons I appreciate poetry as a medium of expression. But with the sci-fi, I'm actually, I don't know if, I think that I consider my audience too much. I try not to. I think I do my best writing in a vacuum, kind of writing for what I want to write, writing for what I want to hear. But with my sci-fi, I want it all to be consistent. So the reason why people say, how come you haven't come out with episode 4 yet? It's because I'm not just cranking out episodes with that one. With the Esoterinerd podcast, like we're having this conversation now, this episode will be up tomorrow, I'll be on to the next one. But with my sci-fi, I take it really seriously, and I want to really craft it one at a time. It's kind of a long-term project. And at the end of it, if I do it all right, then I'll be ready to make it into some kind of graphic novel or something like that. But anyhow, yeah. But with the poetry, that's, again, I crank it out as needed, kind of when I want to just let it out. I mean, I guess there's exceptions where I really sit down and craft something poetically, ripping someone apart or something like that if I have a reason to.
Yeah.
But yeah, quite often it's just, a song from the heart that other people might resonate with, but I think everybody's song, of course, is unique.
Well, there's at the outset, because of where we exist in time and culture, at the outset, there's already a difference between what we're doing when we sit down to write a poem and what we're doing when we sit down to write a story or a novel.
Yeah.
Or a screenplay, for that matter. And that difference resides in the realm of audience and medium and distribution exposure, right? So if I'm sitting down to write poems, I know the audience is the smallest of the small.
Right.
I know that the audience is the rarest of the rare.
Other poets, basically.
Well, by and large, yeah. And so there is no, I'm going to write the best poem I can write, and I'm not at all concerned about reception. I'm concerned about it being simply the best I can make it be, because I owe a duty to this service that I'm engaged in, this calling to speak the word.
Yeah.
But when I'm sitting down to write novels and stories, a lot of that is still true, because I am who I am. And you can't take the Southern Baptist out of it, boy, but there's still this sort of, I'm going down for to the front of the church to express my sins and ask for salvation. Now, so there's a little bit of that there still.
Yeah.
The calling. But there's also this realm where I understand necessarily that it is about an audience, and it's about marketability, and it's about other things that simply are no longer, maybe have never been true about poetry. And so what I'm finding in this, what has become kind of a new enterprise for me with the sci-fi and the horror, insofar as prose is concerned, is that when I send it out to a person, whether it's an editor or an agent, they all love the language.
Yeah.
But they're not ready to bite on the story yet. So I don't know what that means. It may mean that of course it could mean that I just suck. It could also mean that I haven't found the right listener yet.
Right.
It could also mean that there is just there is a chasm, and that there are, here's what I would like to believe, the egomaniac in me would like to believe, that it is what it needs to be, but the listeners have changed, and it's not, the era of the new wave sci-fi writers of the 70s and early 80s. And we're moving back toward, we want high energy, high octane.
They want to push the envelope further and further and further. Like Chinatown, they said, she's my sister and my daughter, and everybody said, "Oh my God!" And now we have to top that. We have to shock people more than they've ever been shocked before after they've seen The Crying Game.
Right. Or any subsequent. Yeah.
Right.
So I think there's this. I think there's a divide between, you'll see editors saying we want stuff that is good writing and we want character-driven stories, but when it comes down to it, they also have a product or space that they want to sell.
Right.
That they want to provide for others to create need and want. And that's never been a part of poetry. It's always been a part of storytelling.
Yeah.
Whether you're a Shope in Northern Ireland or whether you're a screenwriter in L.A., you've got this thing that you're trying to barter with and say, here's my gift. Would you like to give me some gold?
Yeah.
With poetry alone, it's more about, here is my gift. I'm done.
Yeah.
There is no reciprocation,
right?
Except insofar as they may be moved by it, right? Which in my mind is probably far more valuable than the gold, but that's not the way the world is.
Well, and it may shape it may shape subsequent generations. It may become part of future dogma. Someone grabs onto a popular poem to stick into the new dogma when someone takes over. And, the word is powerful.
Yeah. I mean, you think about Hopkins' poetry, and almost none of it appeared in print in his lifetime. Almost none. Same thing with Dickinson. So, what does that mean?
What does it mean? When I was in a band in the '90s, and I was saying let's record our music and convert it to MP3 and upload it to the internet for free, so everyone in the world will have heard of us, and the rest of the band wouldn't go for it. And so I was always that guy, and so I've got all my stuff. I've just recently decided to try to sell my dad's book, so I've taken it down. Until recently, I was giving it away for free, but I always try to keep the idea of needing to please an audience in order to try to sell something out of my art. But that's just my approach to it, and I haven't been pursuing art as my means of income. I'm jumping into being a yoga instructor and sort of trying to make that my means of income.
Right.
But I try to keep my art kind of self-therapeutic. And to me, I don't know if the word pure, it sounds offensive when you use the word pure, but to me, that's what it means in that context. It's like if I started thinking, oh, how am I going to get the New Yorker, for instance, to like my work, then it would just tarnish it. Someone dragged me to a Robert McKee lecture, the guy who wrote the book on screenplay writing, and I had to sit there and listen to him for 4 hours, and at the end of it, I just decided I hated him so much it was unbelievable, and was just ranting and raving about how everybody's writing these canned stories. They're based on ancient Greek, 5th century BC drama, but they've canned it, and they're all just the same freaking third act surprise, underdog, becoming a hero and encountering, and we all know it, and we watch it anyway, just to see the new actors.
Well, to be fair, I'm going to play devil's advocate to my own devil's advocate. I mean, that's part of ritual too, right? I mean, that's
looking
why,
at all the sides, yeah.
That's why we revisit these stories, because they do play a part in our, whether you want to say spirit or our neuronal pathways,
right?
However you want to phrase that.
They seem to. That, or it's just being really re-stimulated over and over, and it was implanted by someone, in ancient Greece. I mean, how far back does it go? The Japanese have drama, but they don't have the third act surprise. I think it might be a Greek thing. Like if someone was trying to deprogram themselves from whatever in Western civilization, they might want to get away from that. I think that might be where not Bukowski, the other one, Burroughs was coming from with the word virus. Getting rid of that, scrambling it up.
Yeah, and then okay, so let's just do cut-ups.
Yeah, he's inspired.
We'll
write
one of my
teachers.
The linear narrative, cut it up into a dozen different pieces, throw it in the air, and then
and take away the Mickey, take away the the power it had over us. And it's true. One of my teachers was a huge fan of Burroughs to the point where he became a Scientologist just to see where Burroughs was coming from. And then that led him to want to get into, OTO and Golden Dawn just to find out where they were coming from, just to really find out what was behind Burroughs, But anyway, so he taught me, I'd write a poem and he'd read it and say, this is crap. You need to change this to this and this to this. And so I'd end up with a poem called Fred and Dog Biscuit rather than, the Japanese monk and the prostitute or something like that. And you say, it's too obvious. You need to mix it up a bit.
I understand.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's it is the problem, right? I mean, if you talk, and we're doing it right now.
Yeah.
You talk in public about your writing being a calling. You sound either like a poser or a wannabe preacher or a recovering Southern Baptist.
Well, not on this podcast. We're all magicians. Yeah. People understand on here.
So what do? If you talk about it as it's all about marketing and money and what your market share is and what the latest rankings Entertainment Weekly say about your film, then you sold out.
Well, that's not, to me, it's not a matter. To me, it's not a matter of selling out. It's just a matter of observing the emotional letdown that results in. It's like when a woman is comparing herself to the cover of Vogue, and you want to say, This is the enemy. Don't you understand? You are beautiful. And that's what I want to say to a writer who's trying to get published. Especially since putting it on the internet means you're published. I mean, you're being published right now on this podcast.
True. Yeah, and that's a whole other thing. What does all of this mean?
Yeah, it's all new. It's a game changer.
What is the ether age? How does that? And we don't know. And it's got bookstores running scared, and booksellers running mad, and podcasts becoming millionaires, and Obama flying over my house in a helicopter to go to Mark Maron's garage for his podcast. I mean, it's getting weird. It's true. Yeah, it's an odd world.
Yeah.
But I lost my train of thought.
Sorry. Well, I was thinking about DNA as the word. Because, the poem that everybody heard at the beginning of this episode really gets deep into the meaning of the word and the meaning of, and finding the word, that lost word. And I was thinking about DNA as the word. And I actually developed a spoken language based on Enochian, so you can speak the DNA. If you search for my name, Edward Reeve, and DNA alphabet, it'll get you there. But it's pretty fun, but the idea being the DNA sometimes, through the being or however you look at it, you could look at it as wanting to be marketable. The DNA wants to be marketable to other people.
Right.
Exactly. It wants to be the perfect DNA strand. It wants to be Superman. It doesn't want to be the nerdy guy over here that nobody likes.
because it's not just natural selection; it's also sexual selection, right? So,
yeah, exactly. But then
to be fair, I should put in a plug here that the idea of DNA being the name of God is not my own. That my greatest professor when I was an undergrad, Ingrid Schaefer, who passed a few years ago, she did a number of essays and chapters in other people's books and a number of talks on the notion of the DNA as the tetragrammaton, ACTG is the four letters of the name of God. And that was incredibly influential to me.
Yeah.
And it stays with me till now.
Yeah.
And so then I, throwing in SETI and other notions, that's my own. But the DNA is really her through and through. She was a professor of comparative religion at University of Science and Arts of Oklahoma, and she was an extraordinary thinker.
Nice.
Probably the smartest person I ever knew.
The way I've got it lined up, I've got thymine corresponding to spirit since it's only found in the nucleus, and since uracil takes its place outside the nucleus in the messenger RNA that I call uracil fire, so then it bonds with the adenine, so I call the adenine earth. So I had the fire on top and the earth on the bottom, and then the cytosine and guanine, one's purine, one's pyrimidine, so I lined it up the same way that I had the other ones. It's called that air and water, so I make little sigils the same way that you do in Hermetic Kabbalah for, out of the rose and stuff like that. And then every different possible permutation of the nucleic acids is charted on each one, and so I call those letters. And then, I just pronounce them according to the letter that's already been assigned to them as an amino acid, because why reinvent the wheel? But I pronounce it the way that Enochian is pronounced. So that way you can kind of get into meditating on a particular enzyme, for instance, because they're much shorter than like a prayer. The shortest Japanese chant is about the size of one of these enzymes that has a specific role in creating DMT in the pineal gland, for instance. So you can kind of really groove on what's going on in the DNA in a more experiential and poetic even, and less kind of cerebral and detached way. So that's kind of one of my things, my ongoing projects.
Oh, wonderful!
Thank you.
Wonderful. I am far more deeply invested for myself in just playing with the ideas. I have not stretched that far.
It's great. It's fun. Yeah. Well, the Japanese have opened it up. I forget the genome.jp. They have the whole human DNA on there, so you can. I have a game, and it's all again. If you search for Edward Reed DNA alphabet, there's a whole bunch of different pages. There's a memorization tool that you can use a four-sided die, and you're just sitting there rolling the four-sided die, and it doesn't look like you're doing much, but you're actually reaffirming those synaptic patterns to memorize the relationship between the nucleic acid permutations or the nucleic acid permutations and the resulting amino acid. But breaking it down to just a sound.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, part of what the poem is about is exactly that. I mean, it's the notion that, there are really three options here, right? There are real connections between what we believe and what we are. There are symbolic connections between what we believe and what we are. And there are no connections between what we believe and what we are. And I'm of the opinion that the first two are both equally true, and the last one can go, take a flying leap. So when I talk about, say, Velikovsky, worlds in collision, this whole idea that Venus was spat out of Jupiter and ping-ponged around the whole solar system for a while, passing the Earth several times once to slow its rotation, so you could have the passage about the Earth standing still, passing again to split the Red Sea and drop manna on the escaping Hebrews.
rationally explaining that, finding an astronomical explanation for everything
right,
in the Bible.
Right. So he does all this math, and he says, here's how this happened, and here's where it went. And there's a beautiful section in Carl Sagan's Broca's Brain where he actually goes back and checks Velikovsky's math and says, no, this is not possible. It would rupture the planets. It would destroy, whole worlds. This is not possible.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter in the literal sense. Yes, of course it's balderdash. But in the world of myth, it's not the facts that matter. It's the story.
Right.
And it's what we focus on, or as you would have it, what we meditate on. Right. It's that which informs us of ourselves, and through that, the universe, or vice versa, that which informs us of the universe, and through that, ourselves. That's what myth is about. It's not about. Myth is more true than fact. In that regard, it's when I talk to my students about mythology in my college writing classes, I say, there was a guy named Martin Luther King Jr., and he did these things, and he did these other things, and some were wonderful, and there were probably a few that were not so wonderful, and I'm sure he probably, sat on a chair and walked around a building and did all of these physical things that physical people do.
Right.
I said, but that's not what matters. What he actually did isn't what lingers in people's mind. It's what those actions mean. To such a degree, they mean so much that they have erected this monument that you can visit, which I did a few years ago, finally, on the Mall in Washington, D.C. And here is this mountain that is cloven in two, and here is this statue of this figure. And I asked my students, I said, is that statue Martin Luther King Jr., or is it the idea of Martin Luther King Jr.? And they struggle with that, and the answer has to be that it's the idea. The man is extraordinary, yes.
Well,
but
I
the
think someone
idea
could call
of the man
on the question.
is not just extraordinary; it's eternal.
Right.
Right. It's so much bigger than the physical, biological, temporal data that we could gather.
Yeah.
It's the poetry of the man is bigger than the line breaks or the periods or the commas of the man.
It's hard to point to a man. You could point to a brain and say, when that thing dies, the man dies. But what about, how he looks in everyone else's eyes? And
when someone asks me, why do you write what you write? Well, I could give you 40 different answers, and they would all be true to a certain degree.
Yeah, on a particular day. That's why I'm writing now.
But none of them are wholly true.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Is it because I read Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes? Is it because and I just start going down the line. What is it? Is it because somebody set my hair on fire and this on the bus when I was in 7th grade? What is it? Is it because I read Tolkien and it gave me an escape from the bullies? I don't know. All of them are true. That's a complicated thing, and that's what poetry can do is bring all of those things into a constellation revolving around a center of gravity. But as you get closer and closer to that gravity, you realize that it's actually not just a center of gravity, it's a singularity, and you can't reach the center. Right. You can only ever approach it asymptotically, and you're
Words
always going to
can't reach the center.
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. It's like the best the words can do is to lead you to ultimate silence.
Yeah.
Like that statue of Mercury pointing up.
Yeah.
I had this past life flashback one time where I was a shaman's, whatever they call the one who keeps the runes, the one who keeps the history in a particular tribe in Viking, I don't know, pre-Viking, proto-Viking, something rather. And my father was teaching me the histories and teaching me, to be literate. And I had grown up, drilling this stuff. And I was supposed to keep the stories on behalf of it, everyone in the village. And then I started writing my own stories, and I got kicked out. And so I was kind of had to rough it on my own, and ended up getting adopted by a neighboring village, but not as, of course, the scribe, just as the husband of one of the daughters. But it's kind of an interesting, because it's, then it's like, okay, well, what is that? Was that a dream? Was that a past life memory? Was that a story? Is it fiction?
Yeah.
Is it something from the Akashic record that I downloaded? Why was it so complete when I got it?
Well, and even within that story, right? You've got the you who wants to write your own story, and you've got the tradition that wants you to write their story.
Yeah.
And there's this interaction between the two. And that's precisely what you're talking about, right? Is this really your story? Is it a story that's out of the cultural consciousness, the collective unconscious?
Yeah.
Something else? Who, from my perspective, who cares?
Yeah.
It's what drives us forward, which is, again, sort of the theme of the Lost Word. It's just this, it's all of these stories. We are all striving for a way of defining this word, this purpose. And for me, it's not the definition that matters. It's the work and the passion that drives you to find the word.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's what drives us forward. That's what keeps us seeking. It's why we there's a reference in the poem to, sending a social networking message to the planet, to the stellar system, Gliese, right? Bebo sent this message that will be arriving in probably, I think it's another 10, 20 years. It'll be arriving there. Why do that? Why seek out, other lives and other civilizations, to quote another mythology? Sorry. Why do that? Well, because we desire. It's Faust in Goethe's version of Faust, right? If I ever become complacent, he tells Mephistopheles, then you can take me. And that's that romantic ideal of, it's the striving that matters.
Yeah.
Wednesday, I am at
it's Fauché Temple. Is it? It's the actual.
Yeah, it's Fauché Lodge.
All right, let me get that one.
So I'll be talking about the Lost Word. I've got a slideshow, PowerPoint, whatever, where I've got images from some of the things that I reference, and I'm going to try to unpack some of it. It's going to be interesting because I've never talked about a poem that I haven't actually read beforehand to the attending people. But Curtis kind of wanted me to, just talk about it as is and just jump into the discussion. So that should be interesting.
Nice. So that's Culver City Fauché Lodge number 467 F&AM. And if you want to call them for more specific information, their phone number is 424-276-0467. They are at 9635 Venice Boulevard in Culver City. And we're going to be interviewing their organist. Actually, I've already interviewed him. He's going to be in episode 33. This is episode 32 we're currently recording. I think he said meet and greet at 7:30, I believe. Wednesday, November 18th at that location. If you want to meet Bryan and hear more about poetry and all that good stuff. And about this poem specifically.
It's the poem that introduced Master Shoemaker to his lodge.
Mm-hmm.
It's also the poem that's been recorded by Clive Revill, and his reading is just extraordinary.
Yeah, that's at the beginning of this episode.
And it showed up in the one of the Masonic journals, Philolethes. I think it's volume 64, number 3, 2011.
Nice.
So it's made the rounds, and that's what I'll be talking about mostly. The following day, at some point, I also have a straight up poetry reading at Cal Poly.
Oh, that sounds like fun.
Well, thank you so much for having me on your show.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for joining us on the Esoterinerd podcast. And hopefully I will see you next Wednesday. I'm not 100% sure I'm going to be able to make it, but hopefully I'll see you there.
All right. I would love to see you. All right. Take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Bryan, for joining us on the podcast. Thank you, Curtis Shoemaker, for arranging this interview. Those of you who are inclined toward healing energy work for your fellow humankind, and or prayer work, I'm sure I don't need to tell you that there are people who've lost their loved ones recently in Beirut and other places. So, take a moment of silence. We'll send out our radiant love and compassion for those who have just crossed over and those who mourn. Thank you all for tuning in.